Hello guys, welcome to MindMajix, and in this special session our trainer will explain everything you need to know about the Spring Boot. Before beginning the session, let's look at the topics you will cover in this video. We shall start with Introduction to Spring Boot. Features of Spring Boot. Why do we need Spring Boot? Spring Boot market trend, and we will end this session with Model View Controller Workflow. Please check the caption to jump between the topics. If you are new to the MindMajix channel, please subscribe and press the bell icon to get quick updates about the new tech tutorials, free webinars, and career-enhancing shorts from working professionals. Like and share the video. Without any further delay, let's start the video.
The first one is, what is Spring Boot? Spring Boot is basically one simple Spring module that provides RAD feature to the Spring framework. RAD means Rapid Application Development. I mean to say, whatever the applications we are implementing with the Spring, instead of Spring, nowadays most of the companies are using Spring Boot because Spring Boot takes very less time to implement application when compared to Spring. And in some of the tutorials, they are trying to say Spring Boot is a framework. No, Spring Boot is not a framework. Spring Boot is one simple, a Spring module which simplifies the Spring application development. And one more point is, Spring Boot is built on top of the Spring framework. I mean to say, whatever the concepts we are using as part of Spring application development, the same pattern we are following actually, but it provides some abstraction on Spring's framework. I mean to say, for example, for implementing Spring application, if we are trying to implement around 10 resources, but when it comes to Spring Boot point of view, there may be 3 or 4 resources are enough, because there are many some auto configuration features and many other features are there which simplifies the Spring application development. Spring Boot provides an easier and faster way to set up, configure, and run both sample and web-based applications. Generally, what happens if it is a standalone application, we are just going to click on run button, right? If it is web application, we are trying to run that application with the help of server. But when it comes to Spring Boot point of view, either it may be standalone application, either it may be web application. We are just trying to run the application just like a standalone application. How simple it is, right? So what I mean to say, I'm just going to display one simple picture regarding Spring Boot. A Spring Boot is nothing but Spring framework plus embedded HTTP server, either Tomcat or Jetty. So Spring Boot is nothing but Spring framework which comes along with one embedded HTTP server. I mean to say, as part of Spring Boot, you no need to bother about server. And you no need to bother about XML configuration. So that's the reason a Spring framework plus embedded HTTP servers, there we need to detect XML bean configuration that is equal to Spring Boot. This is the one simple form of Spring Boot. A Spring Boot is nothing but there is Spring framework, but only the facilities, the embedded HTTP servers will come automatically, and you no need to bother about XML beans configuration because it supports auto configuration feature. So when it comes to Spring Boot point of view, basically, as I already told you, Spring Boot is a simple Spring module. The type is Spring module. And Spring Boot introduced by the team name is Pivotal Team. I mean, the same team of Spring's team actually. Initial version of Spring Boot, which was released in the year 2014 as version name is 1.0 in the month of April. But now the current version, we are using 2.6.6, that is the stable version. But there may be 3.x also released into the market. But 2.6.6 is the stable version. That is released in the year 2022. I mean, so this year in the month April. Why most of the companies are preferred to implement their applications by using Spring Boot? Why they are not interested to implement their applications using Spring? Because there are some problems with Spring. What are the problems? The first problem is when we are implementing any Spring application, the first thing is we need to write lots of XML as part of configuration. As part of dependency injection, we need to write a lot of XML files. For example, if you are working with a Spring JDBC, then you need to write XML code, XML configuration related to your user-defined bean, related to your data source bean, related to your JDBC template bean. So all the beans configurations are required. But when it comes to Spring Boot, as I already told you, you no need to bother about XML configuration because Spring Boot supports auto configuration feature. And one more drawback is the developers need to write a lot of code. Basically, we call it as boilerplate code, even though it is a simple task. To do the minimal task, the developer need to write a lot of code. And one more drawback is when you are implementing Spring application, if it is a web application, to test your Spring application, you need to set some server explicitly. Either it may be Tomcat, WebLogic, JBoss, Glassfish, whatever it may be, the server need to be integrated explicitly. But when it comes to Spring Boot, as I already told you, you no need to bother about HTTP server that comes, automatically. And one more point, one more drawback is developers manually define all the dependencies which are required for your Spring project in form.xml file. For example, if you are trying to work with Spring web application, there may be required of 8 to 10 dependencies. You need to focus on each and every dependency. In case if one dependency is missing, then you are unable to run your application. But in Spring Boot, so there is some feature, a starter form. So by using that, you can simplify the application development. There you just need to add only one dependency. You no need to bother about the remaining dependencies that will come automatically. How simple it is, right? So why most of the companies are using Spring Boot? Because as I already told you, there are many features in Spring Boot. So among those features, actually here I highlighted some of the features in Spring Boot. That is, the first one is easy to implement a Spring application. As I already told you, when it comes to Spring point of view, even though for a minimal task, we need to write a lot of boilerplate code and we need to write a lot of XML configuration. But when it comes to Spring Boot point of view, there are many tools are there to create Spring Boot application and very less resources are required to implement Spring Boot application. And the development time also very less to implement Spring Boot application. As part of productivity also, the productivity is more when compared to Spring applications. A Spring Boot also uses it to implement Spring applications, but in a simple manner, in an easy way. And one more feature is, as I already told you, Spring Boot comes with embedded HTTP servers. I mean to say, you no need to bother about any web server. You no need to integrate any web server to your IDE. So that will come automatically. Basically, Spring Boot comes with the Tomcat or Jetty as an embedded servers. And one more feature is, as I already told you, a starter POM actually. What is meant by a starter POM? When you are implementing Spring application, there you need to add a lot of dependencies in your POM.xml file. Am I right on that? For example, as I already told you, when you are trying to implement a Spring MVC based REST application, which supports the JSON format in embedded Tomcat, then you can create at least 8 to 10 dependencies in your Marvin POM.xml file. For example, Spring-code.jar, Spring-MVC.jar, Jackson.jar, Tomcat jar file, etc. So this is, it's a little bit hectic process actually. We need to focus on all the dependencies. But what happened when it comes to Spring Boot? Spring Boot takes away all these pains and lets you write the code that matters. I mean to say, if your Spring Boot application is trying to work with Spring Web application, then you just need to add only one dependency, that is Spring Starter Web dependency. The remaining dependencies will come automatically. Okay. I mean to say, while auto configuration takes away the pain of configuring common functionalities, then the starter POM take away pain by finding and adding common dependencies to your project. So in order to build a simple Spring MVC based REST application that supports Jackson and to run it in embedded container, you would at least need to add the following dependencies. Like as I already told you, Spring Core, Spring Web MVC, Jackson Database, Tomcat embedded core, Tomcat embedded EL jar file, Tomcat embedded logging -jul jar file, all these jar files. But by using Spring Boot starter POM or starter dependency feature, you can get all of these by just adding only one dependency, that is Spring Boot starter web dependency in your POM.xml file. So instead of adding all these dependencies and worrying about their compatible version, you just need to add only one. You don't need to worry about versions. You don't need to worry about all the required dependencies. You will also be more confident that tried and tested versions of libraries that you are using in your application development. And there you no need to be worried about compatibility or incompatibility issues in your Spring Boot application. Another benefit of the starter POM feature is that you don't need to remember or search dependencies. If you are building a web application, you can add a web starter. If you are building a JPA application, you could add the JPA starter by aggregating common dependencies and functionalities that Spring Boot has made easy to remember and use. I mean to say, in short, starter POM or starter dependencies are awesome feature of Spring Boot that really helps to simplify Spring application development. It's like a close cousin of auto configuration feature and it will frequently use them together actually. Okay. And one more feature is externalized configuration. So before the externalized configuration, we need to know a little bit about what exactly auto configuration feature in Spring Boot. So maybe as a developer, if you work with Spring-based Java web applications before, which connects to a relational database, for example, an in-memory database like H2. So then you may know that you need to declare the JDBC template as a bean and also need to configure a data source, which is a dependency for the JDBC template. As I already told you, that when it comes to Spring to any database communication, there you need to write a lot of configurations in XML file regarding your user-defined bean, regarding JDBC template bean, regarding data source bean, all the things you need to do it manually when you are implementing Spring application. But when it comes to Spring Boot, you no need to worry about the configuration. Okay, so that will become automatically with the help of one simple feature, that is auto configuration. Auto configuration methods comes into the picture. It detects the presence of certain a class in the class path and then automatically configures it for you. You don't need to configure it. For example, if you have added the JDBC template into your class path and the MySQL connected jar file, then Spring Boot can automatically configure and database configuration and JDBC template configuration. So which is ready to use actually. You don't need to write manual configuration code. Okay, so that will come automatically. So Spring Boot auto configuration makes more than 200 plus such decision and automatically configures many functionalities by examining jar dependencies. Okay. For example, if you are working with JP and Hibernate configurations, related to application, then it can configure that as well. And if you have Spring security.jar file, that's enough. Only that jar file, you just need to take it. Then it can even configure basic security to protect your application. Okay. But the auto configuration feature is by default disabled, and you need to enable it by using @enable auto configuration annotation or @Spring Boot application annotation on your Spring configuration class. But @Spring Boot application annotations that will come automatically when you are working with Spring Boot 2 versions. Okay. And what about externalized configuration? For example, when you are working with MVC application and Spring Boot, if you want to provide the super and prefix information related to your JSP configuration, at that moment, you just need to pass the required configuration information from the application.properties file or application.yaml file. I mean to say, auto configuration will come up with almost all the configuration details automatically, even though if you want to provide any configuration information, then we call it as externalized configuration. To provide externalized configuration, you no need to write XML code. You no need to write any configuration information. You just need to write a simple information as key comma value pair in application.properties file or application.yaml file. How simple it is, right? And one more feature is Spring Boot CLI tool. What is a CLI tool? CLI, the full form is Command Line Interface. The Spring Boot CLI is a command line interface that is provided by the Spring Boot framework, which allows you to create Spring-based web applications using the Groovy programming language or using Java development, okay, a Kotlin, whatever it may. While Spring Boot aims to make Spring application development simpler and both benefit from each other's simplicity. While auto configuration and starter dependencies are an integral feature of Spring Boot, Spring CLI is an optional one. You also need to install Spring CLI in order to use it. So, for example, if you're wondering how those whole things work, for example, if you are working with a Spring Boot CLI that is going to detect any kind of annotations, that is @REST controller or @request mapping or in use, and it knows which starter dependencies are required to add into class path to make it work. So this is called Spring Boot CLI tool. And there is one more feature also there to create Spring Boot application in a simple manner. So that is Spring Boot Initializer. Spring Initializer is another feature of Spring Boot that solves the problem with respect to project structure. It's a web application that allows you to generate using a Maven or Gradle projects with either Java, Kotlin, Groovy, or anything actually, etc. All you need to provide in the project metadata in GUI format. For example, name of your project, group of your project, group ID, certificate ID, etc. It also allows you to choose a starter dependency from a big list. For example, if you are working with web, if you are implementing Spring Boot web application, then you just need to add only one dependency, that is web dependency. Or if you're trying to work with any ORM tools, then you just need to add a JPA dependency. Or in case if you want to provide any security, then you just need to add security starter dependency. The Spring Initializer project can be accessed using one simple link, that is https://start.spring.io. Once you create a project, you just need to download the project as a zip file and then open it into any IDE, like either Eclipse or IntelliJ, any IDE. You can then edit the sample project to use with your code. Okay. So through Maven or Gradle, IntelliJ IDE, and Eclipse help to give you a basic structure, but you still need to be proficient on those two skills to get a head start. And if you're not familiar with Maven or your IDE, it can be some nightmare. Spring Boot Initializer solves this problem and makes it easy to create a Spring-based Java application without really knowing about a lot of internal details of Spring framework. Okay. And one more important feature is Spring Boot Actuator. What does mean by Spring Boot Actuator? Basically, a Spring Boot Actuator will help you to monitor your Spring Boot application. Okay. Spring Boot application. So the Actuator is another awesome feature of Spring Boot that allows seeing what's going on inside a running Spring Boot application with all its goodness of auto configuration. There comes a risk of not knowing what is inside your application, and that risk is addressed by the Spring Actuator. It provides a lot of insight and metrics about your running application in production. For example, by using Actuator, you can find out exactly which beans are configured in the application context and what are auto configuration decision made, what environment variables, what system properties, what command line arguments are available to an application, and many more. You can even get a trace of HTTP request that is handled by your application, along with various useful application matrices. For example, what is the CPU and memory uses, garbage collection details, web request, and data source uses, all these things. Spring Boot Actuator also provides several endpoints to retrieve the data. For example, you can get all this using RESTful APIs, or you can use its remote shell feature to securely go inside the application and get all the information by issuing commands. It also exposes all this functionality using JMX mbeans, which means you can control them by running using a JMX client like a JConsole. At the same time, you also need to secure access to Actuator endpoints because it not only exposes confidential information, but also it's dangerous, right? For example, anyone can start your application by using /shutdown endpoint. Then through you don't need to worry. Like any other Spring application, you can use Spring security to protect Actuator endpoints. Okay, so these are the features. I hope you are clear with all these features. And after that, I'm just going to focus on why do we need Spring Boot? Why do we need Spring Boot? Because there are many features in Spring Boot. There are many problems when you are implementing Spring application. Why do we know it is nothing but we need it to simplify the Spring application development. When we are implementing Spring application, then we need to learn all the Spring framework and supporting libraries, even though it is a small task actually. So I mean to say learning of all Spring framework and supporting libraries is very typical. As I already told you, even if you are implementing Spring Web application, there Spring Web with some REST API, there you need to add around 8 to 10 dependencies actually. And you need to remember all those dependencies. You need to get it. And you need to write all the configuration information that is required for your application development. And one more point is, a Spring Boot is nothing but an abstraction over Spring. Because the reason is, you no need to worry about all these configuration information, all these libraries information, dependencies related information. You can simply simplify all the application development, a Spring application development by using Spring Boot, because Spring Boot is nothing but an abstraction over Spring. And one more point is reduce the effort of the developer. So what happened, obviously, if you, as a developer, if you don't need to write a lot of configuration information, we no need to bother about many dependencies. We no need to remember those names, right? We are just going to add the started dependencies. That's enough actually. So even though when you are implementing any such a larger application also actually, there we just need to add only the starter dependencies. There you no need to worry about all the dependencies names. You just need to add only starter dependency. Then that will add the remaining supported dependencies automatically. How simple it is, right? And development time is very less because we no need to write any configuration. We no need to add all the dependencies. We no need to waste our time. As a developer, we just need to add only started pops. Then what happens? Obviously, our application will take very less time actually. And one more point is no XML configuration is required. When it comes to application development, a Spring point of view, we need to write a lot of XML configuration. As I already told you, when you are working with a JDBC, a Spring application which is communicating with the database, For example, if there you want to use JDBC template, then you need to write a lot of configuration information in XML. That is your user-defined bean configuration, your JDBC template configuration, data source configuration. All these are required at XML. But when it comes to Spring Boot point of view, we don't need to write those XML configuration details. And one more point is it's easy to integrate any other Spring modules. Like you can easily apply AOP services, I mean, some middleware services. You can easily apply security. You can easily integrate with batch processing, etc. And one more point is no need to add so many Maven dependencies. As I already told you, so we just need to focus on starter dependencies. Only one dependency you just need to add. And you no need to remember those dependencies names also. There are many tools are there in Spring Boot which will help you to simplify the application development, which is help you to create the application development easily by just providing metadata information, right? So when it comes to Spring Boot market trends, nowadays, Spring Boot is many where, I mean to say Spring Boot is using by many applications, many companies are using the Spring Boot, especially for their different application development. Especially production grade Spring based application that you can run seamlessly. Recently, Spring Boot has become a popular framework for web application developers. Through it might not be the most popular development framework. As I already told you, Spring Boot is not a framework. A Spring Boot is a simple module that we can simplify the Spring application development. For example, if it is Spring Web MVC, if you want to implement one Spring web application in Spring, there we just need to work with Spring Web module, right? Web MVC module. But we can simplify that one with the help of Spring Boot. So why it is popular? Because as I already told you, it prides itself of an absolutely no code generation and no requirement of XML configuration. Okay. But we have seen some trends as part of Spring Boot. I'm just going to talk about those trends. The first one is when it comes to Devops point of view. Well, we see the new trends like Dev apps, and that we can use it. I mean, Devops side also we can use Spring Boot. With all the attacks, vulnerability, and security breaches, so that is causing several issues around the different networks. So at that time, DevSecOps involves the integration of an SL security network that figure out security issues and then incorporate the new technologies for keeping away all sorts of hazards. Am I right on that? There will also be more ways to build applications with tools available in continuous delivery and DevOps. And one more marketing trend strategy is Java 9 to 17 version. Any development team, okay, any development team using Java should think of putting their budget into learning Java itself. True, Java has not made any dramatic changes to the language since Java 8 actually, because Java from Java 8 onward, there are many features were added, okay, into the Java. So there is a need growing forward to learn the little things about Java 9, Java 10, but now the current version is Java 17 have to offer, right? The future of Java is less about staying hip and more about laying the groundwork for unparalleled Java proficiency. And one more trend is a RESTful web services point of view. Generally, in RESTful web services, we are just going to implement some APIs, right? API, the full form is application programming interface. These APIs are already ruling the world of enterprise software. What new trends do we expect to see as far as the low code or no code pattern? We will see an easier way of developing web forms with fewer codes for professional developers and a no code drag and drop pattern that makes it easier for anyone with no previous coding knowledge to develop web application. Am I right or not? Nowadays, most of the trending is actually when anybody is trying to implement web application, most of the cases they are, attracting as part of implementing the application by just writing very less code or drag and drop features with all these scenarios, right? For that also, actually, what happened, we just need to implement it for some APIs already actually. So furthermore, APIs are moving beyond the two-way synchronous communication mechanism between a client and a server. I mean to say the point is, as part of implementing RESTful web services also, we are using Spring Boot. And one more trend is Spring Security 5.0. Spring Security 5.0 is on a big upward trend, and with the recent addition of new features as well as support for Spring Framework 5, developers will have to learn and use its new features like as part of authentication login, reactive support, and modernized password encoding. All of these features are aimed at improving Spring security. Okay. And one more trend is Spring Boot 2. There is a steady improvement in the Spring Boot framework versions, with the newest release including fixes like the name is CVE 2021-22060. This release includes 55 bug fixes, documentation improvements, and dependency upgrades. So you can able to get more information in Spring blog, okay, related to Spring Boot version 2. As I already told you, now the current version we are using, that is Spring Boot 2.x. Okay. And one more big trend is big data. In the future, definitely all the people, will need to understand big data in association with artificial intelligence, machine learning, am I right or not? And other technologies also. But their Spring Boot is an important framework for understanding and processing big data. An understanding of Spring Boot plus Spring Batch will be what developers and data analysts alike will need going forward. As from one of the survey, Spring Boot services, like those are the best market trends actually that we are going to use it in many other market trends actually. Okay. And one more point is, one more concept is actually, what is Spring Boot MVC project structure? How the MVC workflow is happening in Spring Boot? I hope everyone are having idea about what happening in Spring MVC. Okay. So generally, Spring is a Java framework that is popularly used in making web applications, right? It has advanced over the past years and came up with added extension and functionalities. Though it is an in demand in the IT industry, some of its shortcomings are improved with the updated frameworks of Spring, that is Spring MVC and Spring Boot. Okay, so either you can, most of the companies are using for some application development, a Spring MVC or Spring Boot, that they need to decide actually what exactly the preferred one actually based on their requirement. What is Spring MVC generally? In Spring MVC is a Java framework that is used to build web-based applications. The MVC term signifies that it follows model, view, controller design pattern. Am I right on that? So Spring MVC is an integrated version of the Spring framework and model view controller. It has all the basic features of core Spring framework like dependency injection, inversion of control. The MVC pattern suggests the application different aspects like input logic, business logic, UI logic, while providing a loose coupling between these elements also. Here what happened, the model part, the model layer is purely focused on, the model layer contains the core data of the application. In general, they consist of a pose of plain old Java object. And the view is responsible for rendering the model's data, and it generates HTML output that the client's browser can interpret. The controller contains the business logic of the application. Am I right on that? So generally in Spring MVC, the flow is actually the client system sends an HTTP request using a specific URL. Then what happened? There is some dispatcher servlet that is configured in the web.xml file. That dispatcher servlet receives the request that is coming from the client. So it then passes the request to a specific controller by finding it using handler mapping depending on the URL requested using either @request mapping annotation and @controller annotation. Spring MVC controller executes the business logic and then returns a logical view name and model to dispatcher servlet. So then dispatcher servlet consults view resolver until the actual view is determined for rendering the output. Dispatcher servlet contacts the chosen view like Excel, free marker, JSP with model data, and it renders the output depending on the model data. So then the provided output is returned to the client in the form of a response. So this is what happening in the Spring MVC architecture, right? But here our focus is on Spring Boot. What is Spring Boot architecture? When it comes to Spring Boot, here what happened actually, it mainly focusing on implementing either same kind of, say web application actually, standalone application, web application, we can implement both. Okay. But when it comes to Spring Boot point of view, Spring Boot architecture, there are 4 layers or main layers in Spring Boot. Those are, the first one is presentation layer. So this presentation layer consists of the front end part, and that can handle the HTTP request. So this request is then authenticated and transferred to the business layer. So now what the things are happening in the business layer? So this business layer handles the business logic. It contains service classes and performs authentication and validation. And after that, it enters into persistence layer. It contains the storage logic that translates the business object to database rows. And one more last layer is database layer. So this layer performs the CRUD operations, that is create, read, update, delete operations. Okay. Spring Boot architecture is similar to Spring MVC, except that Spring Boot does not require DAO, data access object, or DAO implementation classes. The initial point of the Spring Boot application is, as I already told you, it contains one simple annotation in the main method, that is @Spring Boot application. In the main method, it scans all the components automatically that are present in the project by using @component scan annotation. It also configures the application automatically based on the dependencies added to the project by using @enable auto configuration annotation. But as I already told you, we no need to write these two annotations. Instead of these two annotations, it comes with only one single annotation, that is Spring Boot application. This Spring Boot application will automatically scan the required components. Okay. So when it comes to Spring Boot point of view, what happens generally, the browser, so the client makes the HTTP request. So this request goes to the controller layer, okay, controller layer. And after that, and the controller layer maps and it can handle the request. So then the request is passed to the service layer after the controller. As I already told you, the service layer where all the business logic is performed on the data that is mapped to JPA with model classes. Okay. After that, this service layer is automatic. It's going to integrate with repository or DAO layer. Okay. And once it integrate with the MySQL database, then it captures the required information. Okay, and it is going to display the information as a view page. As a result, a JSP page is returned to the user if that there is no error occurred actually. But instead of the view point of view, most of the cases as part of Spring Boot, we are going to use time leaf templates actually. So this template engine is very important in Spring Boot application development. So now you got the point. The differences between Spring MVC and Spring Boot MVC. Spring MVC is part of the Spring framework that helps in handling HTTP request and response. But Spring Boot is the extension of the Spring framework and provides a faster way to build applications. Spring MVC allows you to easily build fully functional Java web applications with the help of Kit's ready-made components, and Spring Boot helps rapidly build production-ready applications. Spring Boot framework is also capable of embedding HTTP servers like Tomcat. Okay, in situation where more flexibility is required, it is advised to use Spring MVC as it allows you to make configurations according to your specific needs rather than Spring Boot. Unlike Spring MVC, Spring Boot is a tool that injects your functionality into the program without the some heavy task you no need to perform actually. You don't need to do it individually. So that's all about Spring MVC and Spring Boot. Okay. As I already told you, Spring MVC is nothing but it's a model, view, and controller-based framework used to build web application. But when it comes to Spring Boot, Spring MVC is a framework to develop REST. Most of the cases we are using the Spring Boot to develop REST APIs. It is used to build standalone web Spring applications. Here, a lot of configuration is required, but when it comes to Spring Boot, handles the configuration automatically with its auto configuration feature. Every dependency needed to be specified separately for the features to run, but Spring Boot has the concept of starter, has the feature of starter, okay, starter form. Once it is added to the class path, it will bring all the dependencies needed for developing a web application. Spring MVC helps to develop application easily, but Spring Boot helps to develop the application easily and quickly with features like auto configuration and starters. So the time required for development is more as compared to Spring Boot because developers need to devote time for adding required dependencies. But what happens in Spring Boot? Spring Boot helps in reducing the development time as well as the dependency related task gets handled. So, and one more point is when it comes to Spring MVC, the productivity gets reduced since one needs to understand the dependency add-ons. But when it comes to Spring Boot, the development time is very less and obviously the productivity will be increased. Spring MVC requires a lot of manual configuration into the feature for jar packaging, but Spring Boot allows the embedded server to run the feature in a standalone manner. When it comes to Spring MVC, a deployment descriptor is required for the Spring MVC framework, but when it comes to Spring Boot, a deployment descriptor is not required for the Spring Boot framework. The four components of Spring MVC are model, view, controller, and front controller. That is dispatcher servlet, right? But what are the four layers of Spring Boot? As I already told you, one is presentation layer, business layer, persistence layer, and database layer. Spring MVC is only designed to develop dynamic web pages and RESTful web services. But Spring Boot allows building different other kinds of applications too. Spring MVC does not provide powerful batch processing, but Spring Boot provides powerful batch processing. Okay. So if anybody asking is Spring MVC is better or Spring Boot is better, then what is your answer? Most of the cases, Spring Boot is much more comfortable to work with than Spring MVC, but as I already told you, the choice may also depend on the type of application that you are working. Both these frameworks have their own benefit. For example, Spring MVC is a good choice for developing modular web applications and omits the developing task of handling HTTP requests. On the other hand, Spring Boot helps in saving time and reducing efforts by reducing the amount of configurations. One common thing that might create confusion is the use of annotations to develop an application in both types of technology. Okay, so this is the information about a Spring Boot MVC as well as Spring MVC also.